It was supposed to be a fun weekend, just me, Jake, and Laura camping deep in the woods. We'd been looking forward to it for weeks, a chance to get away from everything, unplug, and just enjoy the quiet. The first night was perfect, laughing around the campfire, roasting marshmallows, telling ghost stories. But it was on the second night when everything changed. Around midnight, as we were sitting by the fire, I heard it. A loud snap. It wasn't a twig breaking. No, it was heavier, like something big was moving out there. The sound echoed through the still night, and I froze. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, but Jake just shrugged, poking at the fire with a stick. "Probably just a deer," he said. But my gut told me it wasn't. Minutes passed, and everything went silent. Too silent. No wind, no animals, not even the usual rustling of leaves. And then we heard it. Footsteps. Not from any of us, but from the trees behind us. They were slow, deliberate, like someone, or something, was circling us. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaky. There was no reply. Just more footsteps, heavy and slow, moving in the darkness just beyond the reach of the firelight. I shone my flashlight toward the sound, but the beam cut through only trees and shadows. Nothing was there, or at least nothing that I could see. My stomach knotted with dread. Then from behind us came a voice, a weak, trembling voice calling, "Help me, please." It sounded like Jake. I turned to look at him, expecting to see him messing with us, but Jake was sitting right beside me, pale and wide-eyed. His face was frozen in shock. "That wasn't me," he whispered, his voice barely audible. A wave of cold washed over me. I stood, shining the light around again, and that's when I saw it. Just at the edge of the trees, something stood there. It looked like Jake, same build, same hair. But as my light caught its face, I realized something was horribly wrong. Its eyes were hollow, its skin too pale, stretched too tight across its bones. And then it grinned. Its mouth opened wide, far too wide. And it whispered again in Jake's voice, "Help me." My legs felt like they were made of lead, but instinct kicked in. "Run!" I screamed, pulling Jake and Laura to their feet. We bolted toward the car, our footsteps pounding against the forest floor. But as we ran, I could hear it behind us, heavy, fast, impossibly close. It wasn't running like a person. No, the sound was all wrong. It was galloping, like an animal. I glanced back and my blood turned to ice. The thing, whatever it was on all fours now, sprinting after us, its body contorting in ways no human body should. But its face, it still wore Jake's face, twisted into that sickening grin, eyes wide with hunger. I could feel it getting closer, its hot breath on my neck, its footsteps blending with our own. We reached the car, and by some miracle, my hands were steady enough to pull the keys from my pocket. I fumbled with the door, praying we'd have enough time. The engine roared to life, and we tore down the dirt road. But even as we sped away, I could see it in the rearview mirror, running, chasing, its long limbs stretching unnaturally as it tried to keep up. It didn't stop until we hit the main road. Only then did it disappear into the woods, swallowed by the darkness. But the nightmare wasn't over. The next morning, Jake got a call. His cousin, who lived near those woods, had been found dead. The body was torn apart, as if by an animal. But his face was gone. I haven't spoken to Jake or Laura since that weekend. I think we all know that whatever was out there, whatever took on Jake's form, it wasn't finished with us. And I know, deep down, that it's still waiting, somewhere in those woods, watching. It was a quiet Tuesday night like any other. I was alone in my house, reading in the living room. I live far out in the country, miles away from the nearest neighbor. It's peaceful most of the time, just me and the wide open fields. But that night, the quiet felt oppressive. Something was off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. Around 11 p.m., I heard it, a faint tapping at the window. I told myself it was the wind, maybe a branch brushing against the glass. But the sound was too rhythmic, too deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. Slowly, I turned my head to look, and my blood ran cold. There, staring at me through the window, was a face. At first, it looked like a man, just standing there, his face pressed against the glass. But there was something wrong. His skin was pale, too pale, and his eyes, they didn't blink. They just stared, wide and glassy, as if they could see right into me. My heart pounded in my chest as I stood up slowly, keeping my eyes on the figure. "Who's there?" I called, trying to sound braver than I felt. The figure didn't move. It just kept staring. The more I looked, the more I realized the face wasn't quite human. The mouth was too wide, the skin stretched too tight, and the eyes, they were too big, too dark. I took a step back, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, and that's when it smiled, but not like a normal smile. No, its mouth opened too far, the skin around its lips splitting slightly as its grin widened unnaturally. I stumbled backward, knocking over a chair. My heart was racing. Then suddenly, the figure banged on the window, hard. The sound was like a gunshot in the stillness of the night, and I nearly screamed. I grabbed the nearest thing, a book, and held it in front of me as if that would protect me. The figure banged again, harder this time. I could see the glass rattling in the frame, but it didn't break. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the banging stopped. I stood frozen, my breath coming in short gasps. The figure hadn't moved. It just stood there, its face pressed against the glass, grinning that horrible grin. Then I heard it, a voice, soft, raspy, and too familiar. "Let me in," it whispered. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. The voice sounded like mine, but it wasn't coming from my mouth. It was coming from the figure at the window. "Let me in," it repeated, more insistent this time. I shook my head, backing away from the window, my hands trembling. "No," I whispered. "No, you're not real." The figure's smile faltered, and its face twisted in frustration. "Let me in," it growled, louder this time, its voice distorting into something inhuman. I ran to the front door, checking the locks, my heart racing. But when I turned around, the figure was gone. For a moment I thought maybe I had imagined it. Maybe it was some kind of waking nightmare. But then I heard the voice again. This time it was inside the house. "Let me in," it said, right behind me. I turned slowly, my whole body trembling with fear. And there it was, standing in the middle of my living room. Its body was hunched, its limbs too long, its face still grinning that horrible, too wide grin. But the worst part, its face. Its face looked like mine now, twisted and distorted, a nightmare version of me staring back. I don't remember screaming. I don't remember how I got out of the house. All I know is I drove for hours, not stopping until I was far, far away. But sometimes, late at night, when I'm alone in my new apartment, I hear it again. Tap, tap, tap. And I know it's still out there, waiting. I've always loved hiking. The feeling of being out in nature, away from everything, is where I find peace. I've hiked hundreds of trails over the years, but this one was different. It was late autumn, the trees bare, the air cold and still. I hadn't seen anyone else on the trail all day. Just me, the woods, and the sound of leaves crunching beneath my boots. I was about halfway through the trail when I noticed something strange. Footprints. They were large, too large to be human, but they weren't from any animal I could recognize. They followed the trail ahead of me, appearing and disappearing as if whoever left them had been walking on air in places. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The deeper I went, the heavier the air became. The woods felt wrong, too quiet. No birds, no wind, just an eerie stillness that wrapped around me like a shroud. I picked up my pace, hoping to reach the end of the trail before dusk, but every step I took, I felt like something was right behind me. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but nothing was there. Not yet. Then I heard it, a rustling in the trees. Not the soft rustling of leaves, but something deliberate, moving through the underbrush. I stopped, my breath catching in my throat. My heart pounded as I scanned the trees, but there was nothing. Just shadows stretching long as the sun began to set. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination, but then it came again. A low growl, deep and guttural, from somewhere just out of sight. I turned to run, but before I could take more than a few steps, something grabbed my leg. I fell hard, my knee slamming into the ground, pain shooting up my leg. Gasping, I turned to see what had caught me. My blood ran cold. It was a hand, blackened, twisted, with long clawed fingers, reaching out from the shadows beneath the trees. I kicked at it, screaming, and the hand released me, disappearing into the darkness. Scrambling to my feet, I glanced around wildly, but the woods were still, too still. Then I saw it. Standing just beyond the tree line, half hidden in the shadows, was a figure. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs too long for its body. Its face was a twisted mockery of a human face, stretched and distorted, with eyes that glowed faintly in the fading light. It didn't move. It just stood there, watching me, its head tilted slightly to one side, as if curious. My heart hammered in my chest, and I ran. I didn't care about the pain in my knee, I just ran. But no matter how fast I went, I could feel it behind me. I could hear the rustling of leaves, the snapping of branches as it followed, always just out of sight. By the time I reached the trailhead, I was shaking. I jumped into my car, my hands trembling so badly I could barely get the key into the ignition. As I peeled out of the parking lot, I glanced in the rearview mirror, praying that whatever it was hadn't followed me. But there, at the edge of the forest, I saw it, standing in the shadows, watching, smiling. I haven't gone hiking since that day. I moved to the city, far from any forests, far from anything that reminds me of that trail. But sometimes when I'm walking down a quiet street or standing alone in my apartment, I feel it, that same presence, watching, waiting. And I know, deep down, that one day it will come for me again.